All right, and we are recording. So Dan Carlin, thank you so much for taking the time to connect today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to speak with you. Big fan of yours. So for those who don't know, Dan Carlin is the host of three very successful podcasts: Hardcore History, Addendum, and also Common Sense. And for those, you've received a lot of recognitions and awards, including Best Educational and History podcasts. And these rank among the best podcasts of all time. Dan, have I captured that accurately there?
It sounds pretty good to me.
Okay. So Dan, one thing I know about you is that in your podcasts, and this is unlike some other popular podcasts like the Joe Rogan podcast, is you prefer to be off camera. And I was listening to your podcast the other day, and it was clear to me and to everyone else that you're really good with your voice. You're really good at telling stories. You're really good at pulling in the reader, and you have a very deliberate and articulate and sometimes soothing way of speaking. And I was trying to think about that and understand that in context with your overall like podcasting skill and success. I mean, can you speak to that for a bit, just about your preference to, in general, be off camera and what that enables you to do as a podcaster?
Well, I started off in television, and I think unless you really, really, really love that, once you get away from television, after you've had a chance to experience it, you notice all the wonderful things you no longer have to worry about, right? I mean, if I don't have to worry about three-dimensional, vision, sound, all those kinds of things, I can really focus on what's left. So not having to worry about what I'm doing with my hands, whether my suit's rumpled, how I look on camera, I can just focus on the content and the delivery of the content. And one thing radio sort of taught me is what an advantage and what a unique thing it is to be speaking right into somebody's ears, right? A direct line from your mouth to their brain, a connection. And I think that's something that the more distractions that you introduce into the distribution model, right? Well, video, anything like that, the less pure the one direct pipeline from mouth to mind, the less pure that is. And so I felt like not having some egotistical, not ego-driven need to be on camera because that was already satisfied, freed me up to really appreciate what sort of a pure audio approach brings to the table.
And it really has allowed you to really connect with the listener.
Well, if the feedback is any indication, I think, and we have to remember that you sort of self-select your audience over time. So I think the people that really maybe would have hated my approach aren't around anymore, right? They've moved on to different shows. So I think after a while, the people that are left over are the people that like what you're doing, for sure.
So what would you say, in your experience doing the podcast, has been the biggest disagreement or fight that's broken out as a result of some of the content you produced?
Our decision to sort of lay off of the Common Sense podcast for a while, indefinitely. I describe it like Fleetwood Mac's current situation. They're not making any albums right now. They're not currently on the road, but at any time, another tour or another album could be announced, and that's the situation with Common Sense. But we used to put out those shows, and those were on current events and politics regularly on a pretty regular schedule. I mean, at one point it was like every 2 weeks. We haven't hit that kind of a mark in a long time. But when we decided to back out of it for all sorts of reasons, that's been the most enduring point of disagreement between the audience and yours truly. And I get it brought up in all sorts of weird different places.
So it's not about a particular content itself. It's just the fact that you're no longer producing that content that's caused a disagreement.
Yeah, and with the current event situation being so particularly heated at the moment, I think there's a lot of people who enjoyed the perspective of that show and feel like they would want to hear it now more than ever, and it's not available, so they can get pretty passionate about it. No, that's the biggest disagreement rather than any single thing in any single show.
But what about with regards to any specific content you've produced? I mean, have you ever produced an episode or some content or some rhetoric around an event that people disagreed with? Or
Well, you always get something, but nothing with any like tidal wave or storm of controversy. I mean, we'll do something, for example, like trying to deal with the Armenian genocide in our show on the First World War. Well, that's an issue with multiple angles. I mean, there's a Turkish side and an Armenian side and a global side, and the way people during the time period contemporary saw it versus the way it's been seen since then. So those kinds of things require deft handling, and I think you can always imagine that you're going to get disagreements on those things. But while we get the expected few emails and whatnot, and again, maybe people don't always share it with me, that we need to hold out the option that may be the case. But otherwise, it would be more likely for us to get 200 or 300 little disagreements, none of which is the same disagreement after a show, than it would be to get a firestorm of email about some particular point, or so a bunch of let's call it diluted criticism across a wide range of things rather than anything focused and targeted.
Gotcha. And with regards to your podcast, what is your process for coming up with an episode? When I was listening to your podcast, I was wondering, like, are you reading off a script? Do you have bullets? Like, walk me through your, like, start to finish for an episode. You're doing research online, you're reading books. How does it all, like, what does that process look like? How does it come together? And the reason I ask is because you've taken some topics which people may have thought they knew about, or maybe didn't really care about, and you've made it fascinating for a large audience. And so I'm trying to understand that, and in doing so, understand the process that you take with each episode.
Well, I mean, the first thing that has to happen is I have to know something about the story already. I'm not good enough, smart enough, or educated enough to be able to talk about anything that's out there, and I'm not fast enough at reading or really getting a sense. That's a better way to put it. Really getting a sense of a historical situation in the time it takes to produce an episode, even though it takes us a long time to produce an episode these days. So I have to have background knowledge of the event already, a foundation on which I can start to build, so I'm not building from ground zero, right? So number one thing is I have to know something about it. It has to be an era or an event or something that I already have some good knowledge about, and then I'll build from there. So if I don't know about it, it's not even on the list of consideration. Somebody once wrote me a note and said, can you please do something about like 17th century India? And I can't, because I don't know anything about 17th century India, and I couldn't learn it fast enough. So number one consideration, have to know something about it. And within that range of options, I always try to pick the best stories, so that no matter what happens with my presentation, the story itself is so awesome that it's interesting before I even start spinning my yarn, So that's my trick, sort of. I have every great story from the past within a certain range of things that I know about to choose from. And so I think that's a great advantage. I don't have to come up with an interesting way of explaining something. It's an interesting event without me,
And then what does your research process look like?
I read a lot. That's my reason. And I read a lot, and I come up with things while I'm reading that I guess you could say that sort of reflect our personal spin on things in terms of our style, or we use all sort of twilight twisty things and deep philosophical questions, and those sorts of things come to me mostly while I'm doing the research. So I'll often get emails from people who'd love to be like a college intern or research assistant or something for us. And I always have to tell them, you can't do that, because that's how I come up with the things that we're going to talk about. So I go through and I mark things in books, and then I go in the studio and we sort of improvise. And anything that we like well enough to keep, we keep, and then we edit that with the next chunk that we get done that we like to keep. And then those improvisations are strung together, and eventually we have a show.
Do you read off? I'm sorry, these questions are so like tactical and specific, but I'm interested in the answers. Do you read off a script?
No script, nothing like that. It wouldn't sound the way it sounds if there was a script. No, the thing that I used to do in talk radio, well, there was a lot of things I didn't do well, but one of the things that I did do well is, if you have a 3-hour show 5 days a week, which is what I had, normally when the show kicks off, there's radio works within a certain skeleton of things. There are ads that are built in, top of the hour newscasts, all these sorts of things. And within those open spaces that I have to work with creatively. The one at the beginning of the show, the beginning of the 3 hours, we'd call it like the monologue or something, was the part I did the best, I thought. And generally that was 12 to 15 minutes, usually closer to 10 to 12 maybe, where you just sort of set up the topic of the day or whatever and laid it out and made it a case or a point or an angle or something. And that part was something that when we moved into podcasting, I sort of used as the whole show. And over time, those got longer. And then eventually, and I mean, this was a couple of years into it because we used to do it in unbroken takes. Eventually, the shows just started getting so long that you had to stop and continue and edit another day and that kind of thing. So it evolved over time into what it is today. But no, there's no scripts. I do have marked quotes that I marked while I was doing the research. And an idea philosophically, we have things we call spines, which is sort of a philosophical throughput on most of the shows. Not all of them, because I don't want to fall into any creative formats or ruts or patterns. So sometimes we don't even have a spine, just to mix it up a little bit. But normally a spine is a sort of a philosophical throughput. So if you look at the show we did on the early history of nuclear weapons, the spine in that show is the question about whether or not human beings can evolve to handle the ever-increasing power of their weapon systems. And that idea runs through the story like, touchstones in a jazz song, that we continually revert back to those touchstones. Meanwhile, we're free forming between, the connect the dots areas, if that sort of makes creative sense.
Yeah. And so let's go to like a specific episode, just using it as an example. So I was listening to Supernova in the East the other day, and you give this very detailed story about some of the events that were happening during the war nearly 100 years ago. So in going through this, I mean, the episode's over 4 hours long. So were you improvising for 4 hours, or were you reading off notes, or do you have like highlights and you have a point and you say, okay, I want to talk about this kind of subject, and then you're able to just tell the story? Because your stories are very articulate. Like, is that coming off just in the moment, referencing like just a highlighted text, or?
Well, it depends on the story. Well, it's never written down, but some of the stories are more linear than others. So, depending on the kind of a format, like some of the shows are more conceptual, where we're talking about, like we did a show on slavery years ago that was just about slavery. So there's no linear throughput to the story. It's not a narrative thing where you go and then this happened and then this happened. So that's more of a high concept sort of thing, and that takes a different sort of form than the Supernova show you mentioned, where you're following the course of a war, and things happen in June, and then things happen in July, and then things happen in August. But we do them all the same. Essentially, we go in the studio. I pick up from wherever we ended up the last session I did, and I just sort of talk. I know where we are in the story. I have a concept of what goes on, and I have some quotes that I've marked probably in history books that I plan on getting to. And so I will handle the audio off the cuff that gets us to the next quote. We generally go until it falls apart, because, you can't go on forever. And if it falls apart 15 or 20 minutes into the session, we stop. And then the next day we rewind it to the last point it was good, and we pick up from there and we edit those pieces together. So that's how it goes. It's funny, but it's kind of the way they make movies like Spinal Tap, and some of that same crew made a couple of movies, and they did it the same way, where they sort of improvised and kept what worked and threw out what didn't. And that's kind of what we do.
And it's like, the general, I mean, not just the general, the specific story, and you have maybe a couple sticky notes or something to like keep you on track, and then you're able to speak off the cuff in between each of those. I'm calling it sticky note or some kind of highlight.
It depends. Really, the sticky note would come into play with, like, if I needed something to remind me on Tuesday what I was thinking at the end of Monday's recording session, so I could pick up where I left off. Or maybe I'm walking down the street one day and I come up with an interesting way to describe something I know is in the story. I might write that phrase down. But we don't really have like a rundown or I don't know how to describe it. I don't have the structure you're trying to suggest maybe I use.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it's evolved over time. I couldn't do this show today if I wasn't already doing this show yesterday. I mean, this is something where like I even have, I mean, we even have our own language here for certain kinds of cuts and approaches, and that's something that develops. We're almost 20 years into this, so this is something, like I said, we couldn't invent today, that we can only do because we've built up to this in the sort of a workflow for almost 2 decades now. So I mean, I know it sounds weird to imagine, but starting from scratch, it would be weird to imagine. We kind of know how to do this now because we've been doing it a long time.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm realizing like your stories probably come off more authentically because they're not written down. Like you know the story deeply, emotionally, and when you're telling the story, you're telling the story. You're not just reading the highlights.
That's part of connecting with the listener, right? When there's a certain, it's funny, but there's human beings. It's the oldest form of communication, right? Long before writing, people were sharing oral histories and storytelling and all that kind of thing. And there are people in every society that are good at this, right? There's people with every skill set you can think of. And one of the skill sets out there is the ability to tell a good story. My grandfather had it. Lots of people have it. And I think there are unconscious elements. You can go to a speech and debate class and learn how to do certain things, and go to Dale Carnegie, how to make friends and influence people type course. They'll teach you how to speak, but there's a certain rhythm, I think, that people who are sort of have that storyteller gene, for lack of a better word, and they do it naturally. It's the way you use your voice. You had mentioned it earlier. It's not a conscious thing. It's just, this is how you would tell somebody a story. And sometimes people will say that I sound different in interviews like the one we're doing right now versus how we sound in the podcast. But that's simply because how we sound in the podcast would sound, it's a monologue sort of an approach. You're telling a narrative story. And if I had you at a dinner party and I started to tell a story, it would start sounding a lot like the podcast. But when you're in a dialogue, it sounds ridiculous to talk that way. And it's not because it's a fake way of talking. It's just because when you give a speech, for example, it's a one-way conversation, and it sounds different than when we're giving and taking and interrupting each other and talking over one another and having points go back and forth. So it's a different level of energy and everything else.
Final question on this. Let's say you're in the recording studio. I don't know how long your sessions are, if they're 15, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Let's say you're recording for an hour. You're telling the story about World War II. What are you looking at while you're telling that story?
Usually it's a stack of books with a little sticky note on the edge that says, quote by, Douglas MacArthur on this date and something like that. So I've got the stack of books in there, and then I see the quotes out there, and I'll make sure that the next time that we're at the point in the story where that quote is relevant, I remember to get it out and use it. So that's all I'm looking at. I mean, it's a studio. You got foam walls, basically.
So it's the quotes that are anchoring you, and beyond that, it's your imagination or recollection and understanding of the history.
It's not anchoring. It's just making sure that I don't forget to include them, which is a different thing, because it's easy to forget that, oh yeah, I have a quote for when I get to that part that's relevant. So not so much anchoring is just making sure that I don't blow right past them and forget that I even have them.
And throughout your podcast, you've covered a lot of really meaningful events throughout history. What do you think is the most misunderstood historical event?
Oh God, well, some people would say most of history is misunderstood, and misunderstanding can be an eye of the beholder kind of thing, right? One side of the historical story can think they fully understand the event, whereas the other side would say that they don't understand anything. So where I have the biggest problem, it's more of a pet peeve kind of thing, is when people try to use history to cite lessons. And that's when I think we misunderstand the past so much, because in order to create lessons, you kind of have to simplify things to a point where they become meaningless. So the one that drives me the craziest, because they use it in political debates these days, is the supposed lesson that we learned right before the Second World War, when Adolf Hitler was, and the word used is appeased by the countries that would become the Allied powers. and not stopped earlier in Germany's sort of run to power, right before Hitler was able to gobble up places like, the Sudetenland and places like that. Well, the reason that those things drive me crazy is because we make assumptions about how people act in certain situations, right? Hitler in 1938, without stopping to realize that that's going to be a very unique situation, right? In order to make that situation usable in all the political environments where it is used these days, we have to assume that everybody who might be a dictator is going to act just like Hitler acted, and that they're going to act just like Hitler acted in that one situation. In other words, the variable being a human being means that trying to apply any said lesson to another context is going to be influenced by the variability of human beings, right? Not all dictators are the same, and not all circumstances that a dictator might have an opinion in are the same. And those are the kind of things where we misunderstand, or sometimes I think that the people using the argument fully understand what they're doing, but they're fooling people who don't understand that is a unique situation that it would be very difficult to draw hard and usable conclusions from. Now, I do feel like there are bigger picture things that are easier to suggest good evidence for, right, as opposed to the ones that are as variable as the number of human beings out there. I might say something like deciding to invade Russia in winter, probably a bad idea. Getting involved in a land war in Asia, probably not going to work out to your advantage. But those sorts of things sort of have enough variables that devolve toward the mean that you can kind of extrapolate some useful data from. Once you start talking about how individuals are going to act, and then suggesting that individuals would act like other individuals in very different circumstances and contexts, that's when those kinds of historical lessons become meaningless, and using them allows us to almost intentionally misunderstand them, to get back to the way you phrased it in the question, misunderstand.
So given that, does what you just said affect how you craft a narrative? In other words, you're saying that there's ambiguity about how we can interpret and what we can learn from certain events. So how do you handle that ambiguity when you're crafting narratives?
Well, first thing is you try to show more than one narrative, right? I mean, you try to give as much of a 360-degree perspective as you can, and that gets very complicated in multi-faceted historical events. So, like the First World War, you have a lot of participants in that war, and they've all got their own history of the First World War, and it differs from other countries' histories of the war. So trying to show multiple viewpoints helps to flesh out things and gives different perspectives, right? What do things look like from this angle versus what do things look like from that angle? I also think that there is, when we talk about being sort of fair to the narrative, I think you have to think about how things would have been seen at the time versus how we see them now. Sometimes I think that's another big thing where there's a lot of judgment of the historical past, and that kind of thing drives me crazy, because when you take people out of the context of their times, it's almost like dragging someone today into court who just arrived on our planet and has no idea what's legal and illegal and okay behavior and not okay behavior. And so when you look back on the past and you try to craft a narrative, you try to include this idea that, what did the people in the past think they were doing? And you can't get inside someone's mind, but you can examine a time period and notice that in certain time periods, people have different ways of assessing what today might be completely clear as a bad thing or as a good thing. They may have a different perspective. And if you're raised in that time and place, you may have a different perspective. And so the way we handle these nuances is to try to give multiple viewpoints and to see if we can, get into the head and the time period and the expectations and the carrots and the sticks of these societies in the past. They say that the past is like a different country. They do things differently there. And you're never going to fully understand the past at all. The hope is that you can get a tiny, tiny, tiny bit better understanding than you had before, and trying to see things from the perspective as little as possible that is from an earlier time period helps create those nuances and gray areas that, to get back to your misunderstanding question, a lot of the misunderstandings happen when the nuance bleeds out and everything becomes black and white and good and evil, and that's not how the past was, just like that's not how the present is.
And given that, has your understanding of past or present events changed while creating your podcasts? Like, are there any significant shifts in your perspective or beliefs that you've experienced?
You know, the easy answer is I'm sure that there are. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I think we should recall that, when I started doing these things, to say I was fully formed is arrogant and wrong, but I was a little older than maybe most people are, and so some of those, let's call them bad historical habits or whatever you might say, are pretty ingrained in me by the time I'm 40 or whatever. So I don't feel like there's been any major philosophical shifts. I think politics and current events, there's more room for that, but in the historical sense, I first of all, I try to keep an open mind anyway. Not being a historian, I don't have any hard and fast views on the past. I'm continually trying to follow the extra. There's a lot of new discoveries now in history because there's so many other disciplines that are contributing to historical understanding, right? Archaeologists for sure, anthropologists for sure, but it's like bioarchaeologists now and environmental science people. I mean, so many different avenues where science is contributing to illuminating parts of the past that just were unknown before, that you'd be a fool to think you knew anything hard and fast about it. So I'm always trying to keep an open mind. And when in doubt, because I'm not qualified to choose one point of view over another, I try to give the listeners some of the ideas that are circulating out there, right? And maybe even views about the ideas that are circulating from historians who write and give points of view. I found that to be one of the most popular elements in the podcast. This examining history like a Rubik's Cube and turning it upside down and looking at other points of ways of looking at it and explaining it and viewing it. So I think that's one of our features, not a bug. So we try to do that anyway in the show, if that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And in doing these episodes, what's the event or events that have affected you the most emotionally? Like what has there been a certain historical event? Because you do a lot of vivid storytelling, and so I'm wondering, in the podcast or in your research, if any of these events have affected you emotionally.
Well, I mean, the truth is they all do, and that's why I choose them. So, I mean, I've often said that I'm interested in the extremes of the human experience. We have, most of us, I don't want to speak for everybody, but compared to a lot of the people in the stories that we tell, we have it so good, right? So cushy. So I mean, we're not being tied to a pole and executed slowly in front of a whole bunch of jeering people. I mean, some of the things we talk about in the show are interesting because you can't imagine being in that situation, right? What we hope with the show is that we're helping to create empathy, a feeling of, oh my God, imagine being in this situation. So if I can't feel that myself, if I'm not feeling that in my gut, then I'm probably not even choosing that story, because that's part of the criteria for why we pick what we pick, because there are so many human experiences in the past that are just unimaginable. And that, to paraphrase a historian from a long time ago, you're a different person just thinking about them, I think. And so I try to bring those things to light. And if they impact me, I mentioned earlier that you kind of self-select your audience over time. Well, the people that like what we do are similarly impacted, or they wouldn't like what we do. So the extremes of the human experience is kind of where I live anyway, and what interests me. And if what I'm reading doesn't hit me in the gut, then I'm not going to use it, because it's probably not going to hit my audience in the gut.
What's an example then of an event that really hit you in the gut?
Oh goodness. Well, I mean, we just so we did a show. It's the darkest show we ever did. It's called Painfotainment, and Painfotainment deals with the history of violence as a spectacle, for example. And I think I got the idea for it. I was at the movie theaters watching. I went to see a movie, but I ended up watching about a half hour of previews. And in those previews, I think 150 people were killed, mostly by firearms. And my father always told me that the scenes that they put in the previews are designed to get you to watch the movie. So they're going to put the most compelling scenes, the ones that most make you say, I've got to go see that movie. And yet in film after film, the scenes that met that criteria were people being killed over and over and over again on the screen. And I remember going home thinking, what is it we like about this, and how long have we liked this? And that takes you back to exhibitions like Roman gladiatorial games and stuff. And we concluded in one of the things we said in the show is that the Romans would have fully understood our desire to watch people killed in front of us. They would just criticize the fact that we want to see a fake version of it. They're going to the Colosseum to see the same damn thing. They're just seeing the real deal, right? But it's the same, whatever dopamine or thing that makes that a compelling thing for people to want to go see it in a fake form today is the same button that was being pushed in your synapses during the gladiatorial games, or maybe during the public executions during the 1600s and 1700s. So we used it as a mechanism to try to examine our love of violence as an interesting thing to use as an entertainment or storytelling tool. But in doing so, there are a lot of accounts of things that are just impossible to imagine. I mean, the way that they would kill people in public in the 1600s and 1700s, and people would show up to watch, right? This was an event. So I'm not sure if what bothered me the most was what the poor people on the execution stage who would be tortured for a long period of time before they were executed, what they had to deal with, although we focused on that because that's where a lot of the empathy comes in. But then examine the crowds of people that thought that that would be a fun way to spend the day. We can go to the park and have a stroll, or we can go out and have a nice dinner, or they're killing and torturing somebody down at the public square. Why not grab a friend and a picnic lunch and let's go watch that? Those are interesting questions. And so, I mean, those are the kinds of things where you talk about the extremes of the human experience and the narrative that punches you right in the gut.
What do you think that's about? Why do people love watching others suffer?
Well, it's about something deep inside us, one, and it's also a big part of the culture in these societies where these people grow up. I mean, one of the things we said in the Pain Fatainment podcast is if you took a human baby that was 1 day old from out of the incubator in the local hospital down the street and you put him in a time machine and you gave him to parents in the 1600s in a place like Germany and you let him grow up in that society, he's going to want to watch public executions too, right? So there's something about, how we're raised. If we said in the Pain Fatainment podcast, what if all of a sudden on a movie set, somebody gave all these actors real weapons? This was before the Rust tragedy, so I hope I'm not being unkind. But I mean, what if they had real weapons and they were really killing people? Would people go to that movie and watch it? If they were putting executions on television and charging money like a pay-per-view event next week, how well would it sell? We were trying to ask that very question you asked, which is how much of this is still in us? And how much of it would we still enjoy or do if it were available and societally sanctioned?
And it's not just back in the 1600s that people enjoyed watching death. It's now. I mean, it's not time bound, right? You said you go to the movies and it's on the previews.
Well, so it's tapping into something, right? And look, one can make a larger case about, why our most interesting stories. I mean, look, going back to the very beginning, I think the Iliad by Homer is considered, I could be wrong about this, but I think it's considered the oldest piece of Western literature that we have. Even if it's not the oldest, it's one of the oldest. And what is it a story of? It's an absolute action thriller. Right? It's a war movie. And what people loved it. And so already we have the ancient equivalent of the 137 people being killed in the previews at my movie theater, and people were liking it from the very beginning.
It's a strange thing about humans that we like death and suffering.
I think part of that is we enjoy being scared. I also think we enjoy the adrenaline rush of it all. There's a sense of how it puts you on the edge of your seat because the stakes are so high, right? Getting killed, maimed, wounded, whatever. Those are pretty high stakes. It makes things dramatic by its very nature. So I think there are elements that play into a riveting story that if you went to some tribal area today and listened to the traditional oral storyteller that tells stories, and gets money thrown into their hat for the price of the deal, that they're going to know exactly what titillates or interests or fascinates or spellbinds their audience. And it's the same stuff for whatever reason. So it does point, and that's what the painfotainment throughput spine was, is it points to something inside us that this sort of stuff resonates with for some reason. We don't have the answer, but the question's fascinating.
Yeah, there's something about it. Something that goes back in time and that's still present today. For some reason, people like watching this stuff. Related to or outside of just the fact that people enjoy watching others die, what do you think makes a good story? What makes your stories good? Why do people listen to hardcore history, but they would never in a million years pick up a textbook about World War II?
That I'm not sure what the answer is. I think, one thing I try to do is we use a lot of analogies and we relate things to other things. I think sometimes that makes it easier to envision elements of the past that are sometimes difficult to envision. I think also part of telling the story is the framing and then bringing out some of the things that non-historians don't always think about. I always used to say that, when we started hardcore history, I thought it was going to be the kind of thing that history majors listen to. So it was crafted very differently than the way the shows sound now. History majors already have that feeling that I'm trying these days to find analogies and metaphors and interesting ways to frame things, so that if you don't normally think like a history major does and don't normally make those connections, that it helps to get you from here to there. Right. I've often said that some people can meditate without even trying. Other people need some sort of a guide to get them into the right headspace or whatever. And when it comes to telling these historical tales, people that are naturally geared toward history, that think in a historical way, which is a large amount of the population, they don't need my help to envision all these interesting aspects about, drawing them out of the story. But some of these other people do. They need the analogies and the metaphors and the interesting, weird ways to craft a story where you go, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I see what you're saying there. That's really interesting. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is figure out a way to tell the story differently than a straight historical narrative might get told, as a way, they used to say about Hunter S. Thompson, the author, that he was, how did they phrase it? They said, least factual but most accurate reporter on the scene. And I kind of feel like sometimes there's a little of that where you're dropping some of the straight dates, times, and that kind of thing as a way to gain a larger sense of understanding of what's really going on. And I realize that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's sort of what that Hunter S. Thompson line is referring to too, that sometimes it's more important for people to get a complete sense of deeper understanding than picking up certain facts here or there, if that makes sense.
Got it. And it's in doing so that because people like stories. Like people are not interested in facts. It's the story that has the hero, the villain, the beginning, middle, and end. Although on the other hand, you did say that it's inaccurate to paint many events as just having a good guy and a bad guy. It's the nuance that really matters. So a lot of events in history were driven by societies and governments that ultimately enacted change. But there's a lot of examples we can think of where specific individuals who hold power really make change. I mean, what do you think about individual agency? Like, do individuals really have power to change history, or is it generally just a result of society?
Oh, it's an interplay between the two. I mean, does so I always use the Second World War as an example. Imagining the Second World War with any other person in charge of Nazi Germany than Adolf Hitler is impossible. He's such a singular example of a non-replicatable figure. He's a weirdo. He's unusual. He's not somebody you can just plug and play and put someone else in that position and have it turn out any way, shape, or form the same. But the times had to be right to make an Adolf Hitler's taking of power possible. There's no way that guy comes to power 50, 60, 70 years earlier. He would have tried to come to power in an imperial system with an emperor and a hierarchy of aristocratic leaders. I mean, there would have been no place for a guy of his social standing in Wilhelmine Germany. It was only possible because of the disruption caused by the First World War that creates the sorts of trends that creates an opening for a guy like Hitler. And once he's through the opening, he puts his own personal, individual, idiosyncratic stamp on things. And so there's an interplay between the two, the individual personalities and the time trends and forces that allow those personalities to come on the stage and, exert their influence.
Got it. So it's an interplay. It's the society influencing the individual, but it's also the individual and their unique traits or abilities that enable them to have an influence, be it negative or positive, on society. So how does that apply to someone like Elon Musk today? Is his genius is not a result of society, right? But maybe the things that he's accomplished are a result of the societies that he's a part of, enabling him to accomplish them. Like, how do you view Elon Musk in the context of history?
Well, for me, it's more, I think about it more in a geopolitical sense, because I think you're always going to have the Elon Musk type figures in history. You go back in time and you see all kinds of figures that sort of fit an earlier version of the Musk mold, if you will. I think of political figures. So I mentioned Hitler earlier. It doesn't have to be a bad figure either. It can just be somebody where you sit there and go, okay, this is a remarkably unusual person. So when they're putting their spin on things, it's a remarkably unusual spin. Donald Trump today. Hard to imagine anyone else doing what he's doing like he's doing it. Not a value judgment at all, just absolutely personalized approach, right? So you can't just plug and play somebody into his position and have it turn out the same way, right? So individuals matter, but the circumstances can leave individuals who otherwise would have mattered on the sidelines. I mean, I remember talking to historian, sort of more of a historian of technology, maybe, James Burke, where he was talking about throughout most of human history, most of human potential. You mentioned Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk can be a perfect example. Most of human potential was left on the sidelines because of class differences and all sorts of things. If Elon Musk is a peasant in Holland during the early Middle Ages, he gets no chance to contribute to that society's pushing forward of whatever passes for science and engineering and everything back then, right? So there's, again, even then, an interplay between gifted people who can move us forward in certain areas and a society that will allow those people's talents to be utilized and come to the fore, right? So interplay between the times, the trends, the forces, and the individuals.
It's interesting what you said. If Elon Musk was a peasant in Holland in the early Middle Ages, he'd have no chance to do what he's doing now.
Right. That's what James Burke was talking about when he talked about collective human capacity increasing, because we're able to tap into a much larger chunk of the available human potential out there, right? A lot more people are able to contribute or have a shot at having their voices involved or making an impact, right? If the next person out there who's going to cure cancer is around, they have a lot greater chance than they would have 300 or 400 years ago from being born in a place and a time with the resources to have the impact on cancer. Again, if they're a peasant in the Middle Ages, they don't get a chance to have their human potential utilized at all.
And what can we apply? How do we apply this to the future? Like, given all your research and studying of the past, what do you think we should know as a society when it comes to planning for a successful future?
It's interesting. As I get older, one gets a little cynical about people learning from things. It seems like every generation has to relearn certain things for themselves, which is upsetting because there are certain lessons that we no longer have the option of failing if you come to like if we're going to have another world war in the future, the weapon systems are going to be so powerful that you may never get another chance to learn that lesson, right? If the lesson hasn't been learned in thousands of years about war, then we're going to learn it the next time we fight it. So that's a perfect example. So the way I like to put it is this way, because I'm interested in both outcomes. Either what's happened in the past is going to happen again, or it's not going to happen again. And either way, it's fascinating to contemplate both of those realities, right? And so when you ask about the future, that's kind of how I look at it. Either everything's going to happen as it did, or it's not. And either way, we're going to be in crazy territory, right? I mean, imagine a third world war, because we always have another war. That's wild. Imagine never having a big war again in humanity's future. That's wild too. So when I think about the future, I don't think about lessons learned and stuff like that. I think about things like the fork in the road that we're going to run into, where we're either going to see a repetition of how we tend to behave, long-term patterns of collective human behavior, or we're going to break those. And the potential, if you actually break our long-term patterns and see where we can evolve from there, that's fascinating too. So that's the way I see the future, not with lessons, but with the challenges in the distance and how we're going to deal with them.
Got it. So not necessarily just applying directly what we learned in the past to the present, but understanding the nuance of the present in context of the past as we approach different forks in the road.
Yeah, I don't think that there are those kind of hard lessons.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that falls into the 1938 Munich appeasement Hitler thing, right? Where any lessons that are drawn are too simplistic to be useful, or are used by people that want to fool other people because they seem to know more history than the people that they're telling the story to. I just don't think, and I think most historians, not speaking for them, because I'm not a historian, I think most historians would say that lessons from history is a very tenuous idea.
Yeah. Fascinating. Dan, Carlin, thank you so much for the time and for answering all my questions. I'm going to end the recording, and then maybe you and I could spend a couple minutes just...
Sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.